The soft glow of a phone screen illuminated the dark bedroom at 3 a.m., casting shadows on the wall. Another message, another crisis, another sleepless night. The woman lying awake had spent the last 15 years of her life being the family's backbone, their eternal problem solver, their go-to person when things went wrong. And things always seemed to go wrong with her older brother. She stared at the ceiling, her heart racing despite her exhaustion. The familiar knot in her stomach tightened as she read his latest message. "I really messed up this time. I need help. Please don't tell Mom and Dad." The same words, different day, different crisis. Her fingers hovered over the phone screen, muscle memory ready to type out the usual response. "I'll help you figure this out." But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the weight of countless sleepless nights finally catching up. Maybe it was the realization that her own life had become nothing more than a series of responses to his endless emergencies. Her wedding anniversary had passed unmarked last month because she'd been busy dealing with his latest financial disaster. Her promotion at work was hanging by a thread because she couldn't focus on anything beyond surviving each day. She thought back to the family dinner last weekend. Their parents, once vibrant and full of life, now looked worn down, aged beyond their years. Their father's hands shook slightly as he passed the salt, stress etching deeper lines around his eyes. Their mother's smile, once bright and genuine, had become a practiced mask, hiding worry behind a facade of normalcy. They had remortgaged their house twice to help their son. Their retirement savings had dwindled to almost nothing. Rolling over, she opened her journal app, her digital sanctuary where she'd started documenting patterns she'd noticed but had been too afraid to acknowledge. The timestamps told a story. 2 a.m. calls about needing bail money. 4 a.m. texts threatening self-harm when nobody would lend him more cash. Promises of change that lasted exactly as long as the latest loan did. Jobs quit because the boss had it out for him. Relationships ended because everyone betrays me eventually. Her brother was good at what he did, incredibly good. He knew exactly how to play on their sympathies, their guilt, their love for him. He'd improved just enough to give them hope, show just enough progress to keep them invested, then spiral again in increasingly dramatic ways. It was a dance they'd all perfected over the years. He'd create chaos, they'd rush to fix it, he'd promise to change, they'd believe him, and the cycle would begin again. Her hands shook as she opened a meditation app she downloaded months ago but never used. The soft voice guided her to breathe deeply, to center herself, to find clarity in the chaos. As her racing thoughts began to slow, a memory surfaced, something she'd read about wisdom being the ability to distinguish between what we can and cannot change. The first rays of dawn were creeping through her window when she finally understood. This wasn't just about her brother anymore. This was about all of them. Her parents watching their golden years turn to dust, her spouse tiptoeing around her constant anxiety, her own dreams slowly suffocating under the weight of someone else's choices. The hardest truth wasn't that her brother needed help, it was that their help wasn't helping at all. She'd read somewhere that rock bottom is the point where you stop digging. Looking at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, eyes red from another sleepless night, she realized something profound. Sometimes love means stepping back, even when every instinct screams to step forward. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do, both for yourself and others, is to stop cushioning their fall. Her hands steadied as she picked up her phone again. But this time, instead of rushing to the rescue, she opened her notes app and began to write. "Dear brother." The words that followed weren't angry or accusatory. They were calm, clear, and perhaps for the first time in 15 years, completely honest. The sun had fully risen by the time she finished writing. Her alarm would go off in 20 minutes, marking the start of another workday. But something had shifted inside her. The knot in her stomach was still there, but alongside it was something new. A quiet certainty that she'd finally found the courage to do what needed to be done. This wasn't going to be easy. There would be guilt trips, angry calls, flying monkeys sent by family members to make her change her mind. But as she watched the morning light paint her walls golden, she understood that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that set us free. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply stop, step back, and let natural consequences unfold. It started with a simple notebook, nothing fancy, just a basic spiral-bound pad she'd grabbed from the office supply drawer. But as she began writing down the events of the past few months, something clicked. What had felt like random chaos suddenly revealed itself as a carefully orchestrated dance, steps repeated so often they'd become invisible to those performing them. She'd started the journal on her therapist's suggestion, though she'd initially resisted. "What's the point?" she'd asked during one session, fidgeting with her sleeve. "I already know what's happening." Her therapist had simply smiled and handed her the empty notebook. "Sometimes," she'd said, "we need to see our stories written down to truly understand them." Now, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her, she flipped through pages of entries. The patterns jumped out at her like neon signs she'd somehow missed before. Every crisis followed the same script, like a TV show running on repeat. First came the urgent message, always when she was most vulnerable, late at night, during important meetings on special occasions. It was never a convenient time, never a simple problem, always an emergency that needed immediate attention. The words varied, but the essence remained the same. "I don't know what to do. Everything's falling apart. You're the only one who can help." Then came the threats, subtle at first, growing more dramatic if she didn't respond quickly enough. "I might have to live on the streets. I don't know if I can go on like this. Nobody else cares what happens to me." Each threat was carefully crafted to trigger maximum guilt, to make her feel responsible for his well-being. The next phase was always the promise of change. "This time it's different. I've learned my lesson. I'm really going to get my life together now." He'd show just enough improvement to keep hope alive. Maybe get a job, start therapy, stay sober for a few weeks. Just long enough for everyone to relax, to think maybe this time was really different. And then, like clockwork, the spiral would begin again. A missed day at work would turn into a lost job. A small loan would turn into a desperate need for more money. A minor setback would become a full-blown crisis, and they'd all rush in to help, again and again, like actors who couldn't leave the stage even though they knew their lines by heart. She noticed something else in her journal entries, the way her own behavior had become predictable too. The constant apologizing for his actions, the elaborate excuses she made to others, the way she'd learned to anticipate and head off problems before they fully formed. She'd become so good at managing his chaos that she'd stopped managing her own life. Her friends had noticed, though she hadn't wanted to hear it at the time. "You never come out anymore," they'd say. "You're always dealing with some family emergency." She'd defended him then, explained away his behavior, made excuses. But now, reading through her journal, she saw what they'd seen: a life put on hold, dreams gathering dust while she ran from one crisis to another. The physical toll was undeniable too. Her journal documented sleepless nights, stress headaches, anxiety attacks that left her gasping for air in bathroom stalls at work. Her doctor had mentioned high blood pressure at her last checkup, suggesting stress management techniques with a concerned look in her eyes. But perhaps the most revealing pattern was in the gaps, the things missing from her journal. There were no entries about her own goals, her own dreams, her own life. Every page was filled with his drama, his needs, his problems. She'd become a supporting character in her own story, living in constant anticipation of his next crisis. One entry particularly caught her eye. She'd written it after a rare peaceful weekend, a brief period when everything seemed okay. "It's strange," she'd written, "but I can't relax even when things are good. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Is this what happiness feels like now? Just waiting for the next disaster." The sun had moved across the kitchen while she read, afternoon light casting long shadows on her journal pages. She realized she'd spent hours reading, reliving each crisis, each promise, each disappointment. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't drowning in the emotions of each moment. She was seeing them clearly, perhaps for the first time. Her therapist's words came back to her: "Patterns don't break themselves. Someone has to be brave enough to take the first step." Looking at the evidence laid out before her, at the cycles documented in her own handwriting, she finally understood. This wasn't about one crisis or one bad decision. This was about recognizing that sometimes the hardest patterns to break are the ones we've convinced ourselves are normal. She closed the journal, feeling both heavier and lighter at the same time. The weight of recognition was heavy, but with it came the lightness of clarity. She couldn't change the patterns she helped create, but she could change her part in them. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply stop dancing to someone else's tune. It was during a quiet Sunday afternoon when she truly saw the ripple effect for the first time. She sat in her parents' living room, watching her mother's hands shake slightly as she poured tea into delicate cups they'd had since before she was born. The china set used to come out for special occasions. Now it sat permanently on the coffee table, her mother's attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy in a life that had spun far from normal. Her father dozed in his armchair, looking older than his 65 years. The newspaper lay unopened on his lap, his reading glasses perched precariously on his nose. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of another sleepless night. They'd gotten a call at midnight. Their son needed bail money again. Her father had gotten up, dressed, and driven to the police station without a word of complaint. It's what he always did. The changes in her parents had been so gradual she'd almost missed them. Her mother's once perfect garden, the pride of the neighborhood, now showed signs of neglect. Weeds poked through the flower beds, and the rose bushes needed pruning. "I just don't have the energy anymore," her mother had said when asked, trying to smile but not quite managing it. Her father had always been the family jokester, quick with a laugh and a silly story. Now he sat quietly most days, shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. His retirement fund, carefully built over 40 years of work, had been decimated by temporary loans that were never repaid. They'd remortgaged the house twice. The cruise they'd planned for their 40th anniversary remained a dream, the brochures gathering dust on a shelf. Looking around the room, she noticed the small changes that spoke volumes. The family photos on the wall told their own story. Recent pictures showed her parents' smiles becoming more strained, their posture more defeated. Her younger sister was noticeably absent from the newer photos. She'd moved across the country 2 years ago, saying she needed space to breathe. Her sister's words from their last phone call echoed in her mind. "I can't watch them destroy themselves anymore. Every time I visit, they look older and more tired. He's killing them slowly, and they can't even see it." She'd been angry at her sister then, accused her of abandoning the family. Now, sitting in this room heavy with unspoken worry, she wondered if her sister had been the wise one all along. Her own marriage was showing cracks too. Last night, her husband had tried to talk to her about their future. They'd been planning to start a family, but how could they when every spare dollar went to bailing out her brother? How could they think about having children when their lives revolved around managing one adult who refused to grow up? "I love you," her husband had said, "but I feel like we're living in a waiting room, always anticipating the next crisis. When do we get to start our own life?" The truth in his words had hit her like a physical blow. They'd put their lives on hold, waiting for her brother to get his together. But what if that day never came? Her phone buzzed, another text from her brother. She watched her mother tense at the sound, saw her father stir in his sleep, his face creasing with worry even in dreams. The ripples spread wider, her sister's absence, her marriage under strain, her parents aging before their time, all radiating out from one central point of chaos. She thought about her best friend, who'd stopped inviting her to events because she always cancelled at the last minute due to family emergencies. Her work performance had slipped. Her boss had been understanding at first, but patience was wearing thin. Even her health was suffering. Stress-induced migraines, sleepless nights, anxiety that made her hands shake like her mother's. The teacup clinked as her mother set it down, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Do you think," her mother asked softly, staring into her tea as if it held answers, "that we did something wrong? Should we have been stricter when he was younger?" The question hung in the air, heavy with years of guilt and second-guessing. She looked at her mother, really looked at her, saw the gray hair that had appeared seemingly overnight, the worry lines etched deep around her mouth, the way her shoulders curved inward as if to protect her heart. Her father stirred in his chair, automatically reaching for his wallet in his sleep, a reflex born of too many midnight rescue missions. Something shifted inside her as she sat in that room, watching the people she loved drowning in the waves created by one person's chaos. She realized that by trying to save her brother, they were all going under. The ripples hadn't just touched their lives, they had become their lives. Her phone buzzed again, insistent, demanding. But for the first time, she didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she watched a bird land on the neglected bird feeder outside the window. It pecked hopefully at the empty container, then flew away to find nourishment elsewhere. Sometimes, she thought, that's the wisest thing to do. The morning light filtered through her apartment windows as she sat cross-legged on her living room floor. She'd called in sick to work today, not exactly a lie, considering the knot in her stomach and the headache pounding at her temples. Spread out before her were years of text messages, emails, and bank statements. Evidence of a pattern she'd been too close to see. She'd decided to try something different this morning. Instead of immediately reacting to her brother's latest crisis, she'd made herself a cup of tea and sat down to really think. To look at everything as if she were watching a movie about someone else's life. It wasn't easy. Every message tugged at her heart. Every plea for help made her fingers itch to respond. The first text message she looked at was from 3 years ago. I really messed up. Need $500 for rent or I'll be homeless. Please don't tell Mom and Dad. She remembered the panic she'd felt reading it, how she'd rushed to transfer the money from her savings account. 2 weeks later, another message. Electricity's about to be cut off. Need help. Different words, same urgency, another withdrawal from her dwindling savings. She picked up her journal and started writing, trying to be as objective as possible. When he asks for money, I feel. She paused, letting herself really feel it. Guilt, fear, responsibility. But underneath all that was something else, anger. Not at him, exactly, but at the situation. At the dance they'd been doing for so long neither of them remembered the steps anymore. Her phone lit up with another message from him. Instead of reading it immediately, she set a timer for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes to sit with the urge to respond, to really examine it. Her hands shook slightly. It was harder than she'd expected, this small act of delayed response. She'd become so conditioned to jump into action that simply sitting still felt wrong. Opening her laptop, she started a spreadsheet. Column A, date. Column B, amount requested. Column C, reason given. Column D, actual use of money when she knew it. The numbers told their own story. Small amounts at first, growing larger over time. Reasons that started plausible and became increasingly desperate. A pattern so clear it took her breath away. She'd read somewhere that when you're too close to a painting, all you see are brushstrokes. You have to step back to see the whole picture. That's what she was doing now, stepping back, watching the pattern emerge. The late-night calls that always came when she was most vulnerable. The promises that lasted exactly as long as the money did. The way every crisis was always just urgent enough to prevent clear thinking, just dramatic enough to override her hesitation. Her timer went off, and she picked up her phone to read his latest message. The words were different, but the sum remained the same. Another crisis. Another urgent need. Another reason why this time was different. She set the phone down and closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing like her therapist had taught her. The next exercise was harder. She took out a fresh page in her journal and wrote down every time he actually followed through on his promises of change. The list was short, very short. Then she wrote down every time she believed he would change. That list filled pages. The contrast was stark, uncomfortable to look at, but impossible to ignore. She thought about something her neighbor had said last week. They'd been in the elevator together, and her neighbor had asked about her brother. You know, the neighbor had said, sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their own choices. At the time, she'd dismissed it as oversimplified advice from someone who didn't understand the situation. Now, looking at her lists and spreadsheets, she wondered if it was she who hadn't understood. Walking to her window, she watched people going about their daily lives on the street below. A mother teaching her child to ride a bike, letting go of the seat, allowing the child to wobble and find their own balance. The child fell, got up, tried again. No one rushed to prevent the fall. They knew that falling was part of learning. Back at her desk, she started a new list. Not of her brother's actions this time, but of her own. Times she'd cancelled plans to handle his emergencies. Relationships she'd neglected. Dreams she'd put on hold. The list grew longer and longer, each entry a small sacrifice she'd made, thinking it was temporary, thinking it would help, thinking this time would be different. Her phone buzzed again, her mother this time, asking if she'd heard from her brother. She looked at her walls, covered in sticky notes and lists and evidence of patterns she couldn't unsee. For the first time, she didn't immediately call back with reassurances. Instead, she sat with the uncomfortable truth that perhaps their help wasn't helping at all. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her floor as she gathered up her notes. The facts were clear, laid out in black and white before her. But facts were the easy part. It was the feelings that made this complicated, love and guilt and responsibility all tangled up together like headphone wires in a pocket. Her timer peaked again, marking the end of her reflection time. She had to make a decision. Not about her brother, his choices were his own, but about herself, about what she was willing to accept, about what kind of life she wanted to live. Sometimes the hardest reflections are the ones that show us not who someone else is, but who we've become in trying to save them. The family therapy room felt smaller than usual that day. Maybe it was the tension in the air, or maybe it was the weight of the decision she'd been carrying for weeks. The therapist sat quietly, watching as her brother paced back and forth, his words tumbling out in a familiar pattern of accusations and self-pity. "Nobody understands what I'm going through," he said for the third time in 10 minutes. "Everyone's against me. You all act like I'm doing this on purpose." Their parents sat on the couch, shoulders hunched, looking smaller than she remembered. Her mother's hands twisted nervously in her lap, her father's eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet. She watched it all with new eyes, seeing the dance they'd been performing for years. Her brother would talk about how hard his life was, how unfair everything was, how nothing was ever his fault. Their parents would shrink a little more with each word, decades of guilt weighing them down. And she would usually jump in right about now, trying to smooth things over, trying to find solutions, trying to keep the peace. But not today. Today she sat quietly, remembering the spreadsheets spread across her living room floor. The documented pattern of promises broken, money borrowed and never repaid, chances given and wasted. Today she was trying something new. She was listening without trying to fix anything. Her brother's voice rose as he noticed her silence. "You're not even listening to me. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Nobody cares." The therapist leaned forward slightly, her calm presence a contrast to his agitation. "I notice you're feeling unheard," she said. "Can you tell us more about that?" What followed was painfully familiar. Every problem in his life was someone else's fault. His boss was out to get him. His landlord was unreasonable. His friends were unreliable. The world was against him. He never once mentioned the 3 jobs he quit in the past year, the rent money he'd spent at casinos, the friends he borrowed from until they stopped answering his calls. She felt the old urge to jump in, to defend him, to explain away his behavior. The words sat on the tip of her tongue. He's trying his best. He's had it rough. He just needs more support. But for the first time, she really heard how hollow those excuses sounded. How they'd become a script that enabled the very behavior they were trying to fix. The therapist turned to her. "You've been very quiet today. Would you like to share what you're thinking?" Her brother stopped pacing, their parents looked up, and suddenly all eyes were on her. The moment she'd been dreading had arrived. She took a deep breath, remembering all the nights she'd rehearsed this moment. "I love you," she began, looking at her brother. "I've always loved you, and I always will. But I can't be part of this anymore." Her voice shook slightly, but her words were clear. "I've been keeping track of every crisis, every promise, every time we've tried to help. Nothing changes because nothing needs to change. We've made sure of that." The room went silent. Her brother's face cycled through expressions: surprise, anger, hurt, manipulation. She recognized them all, had seen them so many times before. But this time she didn't let them stop her. "Every time we rush in to fix things, we're telling you that you don't have to fix them yourself. Every time we give you money, we're saying your choices don't have consequences. Every time we make excuses for you, we're saying you don't have to be responsible." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "We're not helping you. We're helping you stay exactly where you are." Her brother's response was exactly what she expected: a burst of anger, followed by threats, followed by guilt trips. "Fine, I'll just be homeless then. I guess I'll just disappear since nobody wants me around. I can't believe my own family would abandon me like this." In the past, these words would have worked like magic, sending them all scrambling to reassure him, to prove their love through another rescue mission. But she stayed steady, even as her heart ached. "We're not abandoning you. We're stepping back so you can step up. You're capable of so much more than this, but you'll never know that as long as we keep catching you before you can learn to catch yourself." Their parents were crying quietly now. Her father reached for his wallet, a reflex after so many years, but stopped himself halfway. Her mother opened her mouth to make peace, then closed it again. Small changes, but significant ones. The therapist nodded slightly, acknowledging the shift in the room. "This sounds like a profound realization. Can you tell us more about what led you here?" She pulled out her journal, the pages dog-eared and coffee-stained. "I've been watching us all suffer, thinking we were helping. Mom and Dad's retirement savings are gone. My marriage is struggling. Our younger sister moved across the country to escape the chaos. We're all putting our lives on hold, waiting for something to change. But nothing will change until we change." Her brother stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed in the silence, but she didn't chase after him. Not this time. Instead, she turned to her parents and took their hands. "I know this feels like giving up," she said softly. "But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's finally giving him the chance to find his own strength. Maybe it's giving us all a chance to heal." The room felt different now, lighter somehow, despite the heavy emotions hanging in the air. Sometimes the biggest decisions don't feel like decisions at all. They feel like finally admitting what you've known all along. The cursor blinked on her screen, a steady rhythm matching her heartbeat. She'd been sitting at her desk for over an hour, trying to find the right words. The draft email to her brother was open on one side of the screen, while on the other, she had her therapy notes. "Be clear, be kind, but be firm," her therapist had said. Somehow, those three simple things felt impossibly hard to balance. She chose an email carefully, not because it was easier, but because it was necessary. Phone calls always turned into emotional manipulation, face-to-face conversations became dramatic scenes, and text messages got lost in a flood of reactions. Email would give her the space to say everything she needed to say, and give him the space to process it without immediate reaction. "Dear brother," she typed, then deleted it. Too formal. "Hey," she tried instead, then deleted that too. Too casual. Finally, she just used his name. Simple. Direct. A reminder that this was personal, not a business transaction. The words began to flow, slowly at first, then faster as she found her rhythm. "I've been thinking a lot about our relationship and what it means to truly help someone you love. This is probably the hardest letter I've ever had to write, but I believe you deserve complete honesty from me." She paused, taking a sip of water, gathering her thoughts. The next part was crucial. No accusations, no blame, just facts. "Over the past 5 years, I've helped you with rent 23 times. We've handled 12 job losses, 7 car repairs, and more emergency situations than I can count. Each time, I believed I was helping. Each time, I hoped it would be the last time. Each time, nothing changed." Her hands shook slightly as she continued typing. "I've realized something important. By always being there to catch you, I've been telling you that you don't need to learn to catch yourself. By always solving your problems, I've been telling you that you can't solve them on your own. This isn't fair to you, and it isn't fair to me." The temptation to soften the message, to add qualifiers and excuses, was strong. But she remembered her therapist's words. Sometimes the kindest truth is a clear one. So she kept typing, letting the honesty flow onto the screen. "From now on, things need to change. I won't be sending any more money. I won't be making any more emergency rescues. I won't be making excuses for you to others or trying to fix situations you've created. This isn't punishment, it's the opposite. This is me believing in you enough to let you stand on your own." She took another break, walking to her window to watch the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, reminding her of childhood evenings when they played together in the backyard, before life got so complicated. The memory strengthened her resolve to continue. Back at her desk, she added what she felt was the most important part. "This doesn't mean I don't love you. In fact, it's because I love you that I'm doing this. You're smart, capable, and stronger than you know. But you'll never discover that strength as long as everyone around you is carrying your burdens." The practical details came next. She laid out clear boundaries. No more financial help, no more lying to cover for him, no more dropping everything to handle his emergencies. But she also offered a different kind of support. If you decide to get professional help, I'll help you find resources. If you want to make a budget, I'll sit with you while you make one. If you need someone to listen without trying to fix everything, I can be that person. She included resources, numbers for counseling services, addiction support groups, job training programs. Not because she expected him to use them right away, but because she wanted him to have them when he was ready. Each link and number represented a path forward if he chose to take it. The hardest part came last, the consequences. If you try to push these boundaries through guilt, manipulation, or threats, I will have to step back completely. I need you to understand that this isn't negotiable. This isn't a punishment or a phase. This is a permanent change in how I engage with you. Reading it over, she felt a mix of emotions. Grief for the relationship that was changing, fear of his reaction, but mostly a deep sense of rightness. This wasn't about abandonment. It was about love tough enough to withstand anger, mature enough to allow growth, strong enough to let go. She added a final paragraph. I believe in you. I believe you have the strength to stand on your own, to face your challenges, to build the life you want. I'll be here to cheer you on, to celebrate your successes, to support your genuine efforts to change. But I won't be here to shield you from the consequences of your choices anymore. That's not love, that's fear wearing love's mask. Her finger hovered over the send button. Part of her wanted to wait, to revise it one more time, to soften it further. But she knew that hesitation was just habit, the old pattern of protecting him from hard truths. With a deep breath, she clicked send. The email disappeared from her screen, but its weight remained in her heart. This wasn't an ending, it was a beginning that required courage not just for one moment, but for all the moments to come. Setting boundaries was the easy part. Maintaining them would be the real test. 6 months had passed since she sent the email. 6 months of learning, growing, and sometimes struggling with her decision. The first week had been the hardest. Her brother had unleashed a storm of angry messages, each one designed to pull her back into the old pattern. Her phone had buzzed constantly with texts ranging from raged to guilt to desperate pleas for help. She'd read each message, felt each emotional punch, but hadn't responded. Instead, she'd written her feelings in her journal, talked to her therapist, and reminded herself why she'd made this choice. The hardest moment came when her brother showed up at her workplace, causing a scene in the lobby. Her hands had shaken as she called security, but she'd done it. That day, she'd learned that following through on boundaries was harder than setting them. The family dynamics had shifted in unexpected ways. Some relatives had sided with her brother, calling her cruel and heartless. They'd sent long messages about family loyalty and obligation, about how she was destroying the family. She'd lost count of how many times she'd heard, "But he's your brother," used as if it were a complete argument in itself. But something interesting had happened too. Her younger sister, who'd moved across the country to escape the chaos, had called her out of the blue. "I'm proud of you," she'd said, her voice thick with emotion. "I ran away because I couldn't handle it. You stayed and did the hard thing." They'd talked for hours that night, beginning to rebuild their own relationship away from the shadow of their brother's drama. Her parents' reaction had surprised her the most. After the initial shock and resistance, they'd started seeing their own therapist. Slowly, they were learning to separate love from enabling, to face their own role in the situation. Her mother had even started tending her garden again, the roses blooming as if celebrating her return to self-care. Her marriage had begun to heal. Date nights were actually about them now, not about strategizing how to handle the next family crisis. They'd started talking about having children again, making plans for their future. Simple things, like watching a movie without constant interruptions from emergency calls, felt like luxury. Work had improved too. Without constant family emergencies pulling her away, she'd earned a promotion. Her boss had noticed the change in her, more focused, more reliable, more present. She'd even started mentoring newer employees, finding that her experience with boundaries helped her guide others professionally. The most unexpected change had been in her health. The constant headaches had faded. She slept through the night more often than not. Her doctor had noted her blood pressure was down. Even her face looked different in the mirror, less strained, more peaceful. She hadn't realized how much stress she'd been carrying until she put it down. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some days were still hard. When she heard through family that her brother was struggling, the urge to rush in and fix everything was still there. She'd grip her desk, remind herself to breathe, and remember that sometimes love means stepping back. She kept a list of local resources handy: rehab centers, job training programs, counseling services, ready to share if he ever asked for real help rather than another rescue. Her brother's reaction had evolved over time. The angry messages had gradually decreased. The manipulation attempts had become less frequent. Recently, he'd sent a short text that just said, "I get it now. Not happy about it, but I get it." It wasn't an apology or a promise to change, but it was something, a small acknowledgement that felt more real than any of his previous grand promises. She'd started volunteering at a family support group, sharing her story with others struggling with similar situations. It helped to talk about it, to turn her pain into something useful. She'd met people at all stages of the journey, some just beginning to set boundaries, others years into maintaining them. Their stories reminded her that she wasn't alone. 3 months into her new boundaries, she'd received an unexpected call from one of her brother's old friends. "I don't know what changed," he'd said, "but he's different. Still struggling, but different. He actually admitted he needed help yesterday. Never heard him say that before." That call had made her cry, not from sadness, but from a complex mix of hope and validation. She'd spent so many years trying to help by catching him, never realizing that sometimes people need to fall before they can learn to stand. Now, sitting in her garden on a quiet Sunday morning, she reflected on how far they'd all come. Her phone lay silent beside her. No emergencies, no crisis calls, no desperate pleas for help. Instead, she listened to the birds, watched the butterflies dance among her newly planted flowers, and felt the rightness of where she was. She'd learned that love sometimes means doing the hard thing, that helping sometimes means not helping, that family bonds can be strengthened by healthy boundaries rather than broken by them. Most importantly, she'd learned that taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Like the oxygen masks on airplanes, you have to secure your own before you can truly help anyone else. A text message blinked on her phone, her sister asking about their planned visit next month. Normal family stuff, the kind she'd almost forgotten could exist. She smiled as she replied, grateful for this new chapter in their story. Change wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply step back and let life unfold as it should.